This is the Hermetic Hour, and I'm your host, Poke Runyon. Tonight, we'll present a lecture on the magic of Franz Bardon, the 20th century European alchemist and magician. Now, Bardon was the author of 3 books on magic and 1 semi-autobiographical novel. His Eastern-style methods of training owed much to Raja and tantric yoga, and they've had a considerable influence on modern Western practice. Now, we'll discuss each of his 3 books in sequence, where his information came from, what his philosophy was, and you'll learn about fluid condensers, volts, elementals, magnetic and electric fluids, and magic mirrors. We'll discuss his debt to P.B. Randolph, and we will discuss the origins of his myriads of spirits and the way he derived his sigils. We'll deal with his unique concept of Kabbalah. And then Bardon's background as a professional hypnotist and alchemist, a healer, and we'll compare that to his mundane life and some of his problems. The master, of course, was an overweight chain smoker who died after eating a bacon sandwich, but he was still the master, and we should appreciate him all the more for the faults that made him human. Now, I mentioned that we would that you would find out why Simon, King of the Witches, kept saying magnetic electric while he was having fun with the DA's daughter. That's a reference to the 1971 cult film Simon, King of the Witches, which, according to urban legend, I was the model for Simon, but I think I want to back out of that one. But there is more Bardonian magic, or at least their version of Bardonian magic, shown in Simon, King of the Witches than perhaps any other film that's ever been made. So you might want to keep that in mind. Well, Franz Bardon was born in 1909, and he died in 1958. He was barely 50 years old. He had a hard life. He spent 3.5 years in a Nazi concentration camp. Of course, he wasn't Jewish, and he wasn't a gypsy, but they also came down on occultists and on homosexuals, too. Bardon certainly wasn't homosexual, and he wasn't Jewish, and he wasn't a gypsy, but he really was an occultist. So he ended up spending 3.5 years in a Nazi concentration camp during the war, and they didn't treat him very well. Now, Bardon was born in 1909, and he was a Czechoslovakian, and his father was, Victor Bardon was a student of Rosicrucianism and Hermetic science in the Rosicrucian tradition. And when young Franz graduated from public school, in other words, when he was just about ready to go into what we would call high school, he took an apprenticeship at the Minerva sewing machine factory, and he was going to be a sewing machine mechanic. And at about that time, something very, very strange happened to him. His personality completely changed. This is what is called in occult terminology a walk-in. In other words, little Franz, the apprentice sewing machine mechanic, suddenly he left, and Franz Bardon, the magician, came in. This was almost as if an alien presence had walked into this young man's soul and body. So at this point, Victor Bardon, Franz's father, had to realize that his young teenage, by this time Bardon was getting, into his middle teens, that his son was his guru. His son was suddenly a almost fully developed spiritual being. Now, this is a remarkable case, but there have been other cases like this, and this is what happened with Franz Bardon. He went along. Of course, he left the sewing machine factory, and he became a professional alchemist and a healer. He used his his alchemical methods and homeopathic medicine. In fact, he actually became a doctor of homeopathic medicine at one point. He was just as much of an alchemist, if not more, than a magician. Now, this is a part of Franz Bardon's life that we don't know very much about because he never got a chance to publish his book on alchemy. That was going to be his fourth book, and he never got around to publishing it because he died before that happened. And unfortunately, the communist Czech police shredded all his notes, and so we'll never get Bardon's alchemy book. But Bardon went on before World War II, and he became a stage hypnotist, a mentalist. He was one of these mind readers that could go out on stage and you put an object somebody from the audience would put an object down on the table like a watch or a necklace, and he would pick it up, and he would give you the entire history of it, plus enough of your history that that's somewhat embarrassing. And he was a very, 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 very good mentalist. And also, he was, as we know in the Hermetic tradition, he was a marvelous ceremonial magician. Now, Bardon wrote and published 3 books. The first book is called Initiation into Hermetics. And what this is a complete course in spiritual development, all the way through from neophyte to adept. This is a complete personal course of spiritual development. There's nothing like this has ever been published before. And I want to talk about this book a little bit and then we'll move on to his next book in sequence. Initiation into Hermetics is a remarkable, remarkable book. And Bardon claimed that he had been, in his previous incarnation, he'd been a Tibetan Lama. Well, I think he probably was on the nose on that. I think he really was, because what he did that nobody else had done it up to that time, nobody else had even attempted to combine Tibetan techniques with Western philosophy and make a perfect blend of Western philosophy and Tibetan yoga techniques. And put the two of them together, and then come up with a training program where a normal, and I say normal, I mean a normal, intelligent human being, not a psychic, not a clairvoyant, and just a normal, intelligent human being who really wanted to be a Hermetic magician, could take this book, this Initiation into Hermetics, and faithfully do these exercises and come out the other end in a couple of years, maybe 3 years, could come out and actually be a Hermetic adept. Nobody had even begun to do a thing like this. Julius Evola he was interested in yoga and also in Western magic, but he didn't put the two together. The same thing with Crowley. Crowley was interested in yoga, and he taught yoga, and he recommended yoga and all of this, but he never put magic and yoga together. He thought he did, but he didn't really. He had doing one separately and then doing the other separately, and he never actually blended them the way Bardon did. And Bardon's training program is absolutely outstanding, and the depth of Bardon's knowledge. We'll assume, just to be cynical, we'll assume that Victor, his father, the Rosicrucian student, that he probably had a pretty good library. And obviously, young Bardon, as soon as he had this epiphany that he had, he probably devoured his father's library. All right, well, that's fine. But Bardon's knowledge goes way, way beyond that. Bardon, his grasp of Eastern methods. Bardon knew more. He knew more about Raja Yoga, and I got 6 or 7 books on Raja Yoga. And that's supposed to be the best ones available. But frankly, I learned more from my friend Oberon Celicio about Raja Yoga than I had from all 6 books on it. Because Raja Yoga, you have to learn it from an Eastern master. But Bardon knew it. He knew how to take the Hermetic elements. And now this is Western now. This isn't the Chinese elements. It's not the way the Hindus do it. This is Western. This is Empedocles. This is Pythagoras. This is the Western tradition now. And Bardon knew how to take these four elements and spirit, which he tied to the Kabbalistic Tetragrammaton, and he said, this is it. This is where we start. We start with these elements. We balance them in our own personality. We create our own magic mirrors where we look at the balance of the elements in our personality and we rebalance them. In other words, this is a form of elective astrology here. In a sense, you're going to take your horoscope and you're going to say, okay, I'm too heavy in this and I'm too light in this, and I'm going to balance myself out. And that's a whole process in itself, which the magician does. And then you learn to completely control the mind. You learn literally to not empty the mind, but completely calm the mind. And you learn to observe your thoughts, and you learn all this in a perfect sequential program. Now, it's not easy. Bardon's program is not easy, and we've discovered over the years, some shortcuts that make it easier to do, and I'll talk about those later. But the program that he lays out is a balanced Raja. It leads more toward Raja Yoga, real Raja Yoga, than it does toward Tantric Yoga, because we're talking about these four elements, these super elements, not fire and air and earth and water as you know them, as you put your hands on them or in them or whatever. These are the philosophical elements with spirit, and you could become a complete master of these elements. And then you learn how to visualize, how to concentrate, and how to visualize, and how to become clairaudient. And all these exercises are a regular sequential training program, all the way up through astral projection and mental projection, and just a book like nobody has ever written or attempted before. Now, I want to kind of put out something for you to think about here. We think about the great magicians in Western history, like John Dee and Count Cagliostro and even Agrippa. And these magicians who did not. These magicians had to go out and hire psychics to have the visions for them, or they used children to have the visions for them. They didn't have a program like this. Sure, people in the Far East, they did, but nobody in the West, up until Bardon, nobody in the West had the course, the training, the way to train a person to actually be his own scryer. And this is fundamentally important, and it's really I can't stress the importance of this too much, because in this way, if Dee, now quite frankly, if John Dee had initiation into Hermetics back in Elizabeth's time, he would have taken a whole year, and he would have spent 18 hours a day doing the exercises, and he wouldn't have needed to hire Edward Kelly. Who knows what a no kid would have been if he hadn't. But still, and the same thing with Cagliostro. Cagliostro wouldn't have had to use children and use psychics, whatever. They could have actually done it themselves, but they would have. So Bardon is tremendously important in that regard. Now, Bardon's next book, after initiation into Hermetics, after you trained yourself to visualize and to be clairaudient and to be the master of the spirits and the projection, then the next book is called The Practice of Magical Evocation. Well, back in the early 1970s, about 1970 it was, before I got the practice of magical evocation, before I got initiation into Hermetics, And I didn't have any, I didn't know what Bardon had come up with before that. And I got this book on evocation with all the spirit sigils, these hundreds of spirit sigils, and all of this business about summoning the spirits in the mirror and everything. And I read it, and I thought, God, gosh, this guy is whew, he's like he's from another planet. This is like he was mad, but it was a magnificent madness. And I didn't realize, that this was a culmination of everything that he had prepared in the first book. And so it took me a while to put the whole thing in sequence. But the practice of magical evocation is another milestone work. Now, Bardon is doing, he's doing a Goetia type of magic. It's evocation with a triangle and with a mirror, but it's different than Goetia in a couple of respects. One respect is that Bardon's spirits, all of his earth spirits, his planetary spirits, they all try to sort of lean toward the positive. Bardon, in this sense, and I was discussing this earlier with Lauren, with Sorors Andrea, who is a much better astrologer than I am, by the way, and we were discussing this earlier, that Bardon seems to be in tune with modern astrology in the sense that he sees more good and more positive aspects in these spirits than the old medieval magicians used to. And so it's sort of a positive thing. Now, in his spirit catalog that he has in the book, in Magical Evocation, he has spirits for the Earth sphere, and they're all derived from Abramelin, from the German version of Abramelin. Stephen Skinner took him to task for not crediting Abramelin, but then, Bardon didn't have to credit Abramelin. I mean, he didn't have to, but that's where all of his Earth sphere, 365 spirits of the Earth sphere, come from the German version of Abramelin. And then moving into the lunar sphere, this is where things get really interesting. We move to the lunar sphere. He has 28 lunar spirits. They're not exactly the mansions of the moon, although they go by that sequence, but they're not negative. And you can see where they kind of derive from some of the mansions of the moon as you go through the various mansions of the moon schemes that come down to us from Picatrix and various places. You can see there's a relationship, but they're more positive. Everything in Bardon's sequence of lunar spirits is positive. Just for an example, in all of the old mansions of the moon sequences, the first 9 of them, most of them are really evil and bad. Well, actually, in Bardon, you can see where they're kind of derived, but he's painting he's showing the good side of these spirits. And this goes along with a more modern astrological concept. Now he moves from the moon into Mercury, and here is very interesting. He takes the semi-autobiographical angels and he puts them in Hod, the Mercury sphere. And here again, Steve Skinner wonders why he did this. Well, I like it because putting all those semi-autobiographical angels up in Hod is really nice, because we put all the Goetia spirits in Yesod. I have them all falling down at the bottom of Yesod, and of course, and each one of them, as you know, as I've discussed before, each sphere has all the rest of the spheres of the Tree of Life in it. So, boom, all the Goetia spirits, the fallen angels, they fall down to the bottom of Yesod. They're down there. Well, now, if the Shemam Parash spirits are going to get it over on them, if they're going to be the good counterpart, then why not put them one sphere up and put them in odd, which is what Bardon did, so that works out fine for us. I don't mind that at all. However, you could be a nitpicker and you could say, oh, well, the Shimon Parash spirits are derived from permutations of three verses in Exodus and all of that. You can split hairs, but that, I think Bardon's okay on that one too. Now, we get up there to Venus, and his Venus spirits are really, really interesting. If we have time, we'll go over this Hagiel evocation that he has, which some people think is a physical appearance thing, and we'll go over that a little bit. But the Venus spirits are really great. But anyway, when you get up to the sun, and here is where I discovered something that I think is going to be of real interest to you real Bardon people who have been taking some licks. Even lately, Bardon's been taking some licks as people dig into the derivation of his spirits. Well, one of the things that he's been criticized for with solar spirits is that his solar spirits are encoded names, Arabic names of the fixed stars. Well, okay, but I discovered in Michael Greer and Chris Warnock's wonderful new Picatrix, which they have out with, it just came out with. It's a beautiful translation, annotated, terrifically annotated, beautiful translation of the European Latin version of the Picatrix. This is just this is the granddaddy of all the grimoires. And in Picatrix, now, in this Picatrix, it points out that the old Sabaeans of Haran, the star worshippers who started our Hermetic planetary magic tradition, that they knew that the sun was the center of the solar system, but they also thought that the sun was the center of the universe. And so they said that the fixed stars were the handmaidens of the sun. Now, so if you want to, so Stephen, let's let Bardon off the hook on that one, because I think he had a rationale there, a very ancient rationale, and so we move on up to the higher planets, and the Mars spirits. Bardon said, I'm not going to give you the Mars spirits. He said, I'm not going to give them to you because you get in trouble and they're dangerous. And if you get to that point in development, you can do them yourself. And he said that right in the book. And then somehow or other, I don't know, maybe his secretary, Adi, blame it on Adi, she may have put down these zodiacal, this list of zodiacal spirits there the Deccan spirits, sort of as a Mars list, but it really wasn't a Mars list at all. I think I'm not going to, I can't see where that would come from, because he just said, just before that, he said he wasn't going to give you any Mars spirits. And the Saturn thing the same way. So I think that the criticism of Bardon and his spirits, I think we pretty well put that to rest. His spirits are fine. And, another thing about Bardon's spirits, and while we're on the subject of this, as a magician who does evocation on a regular basis, including Bardonian, I can tell you this: Franz Bardon did not have a fully equipped magical temple. He didn't need one. He was such a consummate master. He did not need all the toys. When he did his evocations, he went outside at night, went out into the park, and looked up at the stars with his hands in his pockets probably, and looked up at the stars and did it that way. That's the way he did it. Then he came back, had himself a cup of coffee, and wrote in his Liber Spiritum, and did the sigils in his Liber Spiritum, and wrote about the spirits. Now, that's how he did it. That isn't the way he wanted you to do it, but that's the way he did it. Now, those sigils, if you look at all these sigils in magical evocation. Oh gosh, there's just myriads of these signatures of spirits, and they're free form. They're flowing. They're just like they're like squiggles. They're like doodles. They're like squiggles, and you wonder. Some people wonder how why are they this way? Well, they're this way because this is the way that magicians used to get signatures of spirits. They had, and Bardon doesn't really tell you this, but he's certainly doing it. The old magicians who were doing these evocations, they had what they called a liber spirital, a book of spirits, and this was a book of personal contact. It was the personal diary of a spirit operation. And what they would do was they would get the spirit in the mirror or in the crystal or how they want to do it, and then they would ask the spirit to sign their book, and then the spirit would take over their hand and with their pen and automatic and using automatic writing, the spirit would give you a signature or her signature, and then the magician could use that signature again to summon the spirit. Well, now, this was all very well and fine and all that in the Renaissance, but unfortunately, when the Faustian school came along, you know what they did with it. Oh, this was a pact. Well, no, it wasn't a pact at all, not originally. It was your conversation with the spirit. The spirit signs your guest book, and then you've got the spirit signature, and you can go back and use the spirit signature again. But there's something I want to point out here. Now, this is how Bardon did his sigils. There are other ways to do sigils, of course, and there are other ways that sigils are made. They can be magical symbols strung out in a line. They can be magical alphabet jammed together. They can be a monogram put together. They can be some sort of a geometric design that relates to it, or they can be a kamea. They can be made on a magic square. So there's any number of ways you can do magical sigils. But the way Bardon did it was he did this automatic writing, which is the old Renaissance way, the old Renaissance medieval way with the spirit book. Now, the important thing about this, and I really want to stress this, is that Bardon, these are Bardon's signatures. These are his personal signatures for the spirits. Now, you want to use them, and a lot of people do. If you want to use them to contact those spirits, okay, that's fine. But really, they're Bardon's. You should have your own spirit book, and you should go and you should get the spirit to sign your book with your hand, so it's your spirit, your signature of the spirit. That's what you should do, and that's what Bardon. If he was looking over my shoulder right now, I'd be smiling and he'd be saying, "Yeah, that's what I want you to do," because that really is what a real magician would do. You get your own signatures, and so I want to get that point across. But as Stephen Skinner says in his Magician's Companion, even after criticizing the derivation of the spirits, this is the best book on evocation that's come out in the 20th century, and probably will be for quite some time to come. Now, after this, Bardon wrote a book called The Key to the True Kabbalah. I mean, spelled Kabbalah. I don't have the book in front of me right now, so I think it's QA. It was a QABBALAHAH or something or other. Anyway, it was a strange spelling of Kabbalah. And Bardon's Kabbalah is it's a small book of Kabbalistic formulas. And the whole book, but it's a transposed German alphabet. It's not the Hebrew alphabet. It's transposed. His Kabbalah is transposed into a German alphabet. So it works out great if you're German, I suppose. But the Kabbalistic system itself is a set of formulas which apparently, as near as I can see, and figure. Somebody I know. Next week we're going to have call-ins on Bardon next week, so you can get you Bardon guys get cocked and loaded here. You can come after me on this one, but I think that Bardon's main source on the formulas in his Key to the True Kabbalah are the Sefer Raziel. This was one of the most powerful and one of the the oldest and most powerful of the Kabbalistic grimoires. And I highly recommend that you get a copy of my colleague and my esteemed colleague, Maestro Steve Sabdo, has a wonderful translation of this. And get this, compare it to what you see in Bardon's Key to the True Kabbalah. You may agree with me, or you may not. But regardless, it certainly doesn't reflect badly on Franz. Now, one thing, though, that we want to mention about the Key to the True Kabbalah before we move on is that the really important thing in the Key to the True Kabbalah is his concept of the pronunciation of the holy name. Now, he claims, or the publisher claims, this book will show you how to truly pronounce the holy name. Well, in this case, we're talking about YHVH. I would prefer to use Masha or Shama Ata, but whatever tetragrammaton you want to use. I believe that Bardon has come the closest to coming up with the real truth about how to pronounce it. And what his concept is in this book is that you visualize in the proper color scales of all four dimensions of the Kabbalah, visualize the tetragrammaton as you pronounce it in all four color scales simultaneously as you do the pronunciation. And this is the true pronunciation. So it's not so much the sound as it is the visualization and the intonation in all four dimensions. And that is certainly a very unusual but a profound concept that he has there. And that alone is worth the price of the book. But let's dig into this Sefer Raziel thing and see if I'm right or if I'm wrong or whatever. And you can pick on me next week about that. Now, let's discuss something here about fluid condensers and volts. Fluid condensers. This is something that people run into in initiation into Hermetics, and you also find it later for charging mirrors and wands and whatever in Evocation. But Bardon has an emphasis, and this is an alchemical kind of a magical alchemical thing, about creating these fluid condensers, which he makes up either out of metal or out of plants. So it's either plant alchemy or metal alchemy, either way you want to go. And these compounds, herbal compounds or metallic compounds, are designed, they're called fluid condensers, not because they're condensing wet fluid. This is to condense astral fluid, condense spiritual fluid. So when you fill a wand up with a whole bunch of different filings from the primary metals of the planets, well, you take, like I just did recently, we got a great big beautiful magic mirror about 30 inches across, concave mirror, and I had gold filings, I had silver filings, I had lead filings, I had brass filings, and I sprinkled these all over the lacquer as it's starting to, before it sets up. Sprinkled them in a round pattern, in a pattern, and then sealed it over. Now this is the way you make a Bardonian magic mirror. You use it, and this is a universal metallic alchemy, universal fluid condenser for planetary magic. And the lead granules were a little bit it was just kind of interesting. The lead granule was just a little bit coarser than the rest of them, and so I can see the lead. I can see the the lead granules around there. So the Saturn aspect of this thing, sort of swirling around. And these fluid condensers are you can put them in magical images. You can use them to charge magical talismans. You can use these fluid condensers for just about everything. In the film Simon King of the Witches, they call this thing an effluvial an effluvial condenser. Effluvium being, well, you know what effluvium is, but anyway, and they charge it, and make it glow. In Simon King of the Witches is one of the big scenes in there, but they finally get the condenser charged. But actually, these condensers are, they go all the way back to the Hermetic treatises, the Asclepius, where it talks about filling magical statues, idols full of various herbs and all to attract the spirits. That's where it gets started. But it's interesting to note and that Bardon's recipes for fluid condensers are very similar and somewhat simpler than the same set of fluid condenser recipes that we find in the works of Pascal Beverly Randolph 100 years earlier. So this is not something that Bardon invented himself. And I don't think, I'm not going to try to say that Bardon, I don't want to give the impression that Bardon lifted this from P.B. Randolph and didn't give him credit. That's not it, because Randolph's work had already been incorporated into those various lodges. By this time, there were secret papers on Randolph's work that were floating around that didn't credit Randolph at all. So Bardon is off the hook on that one. But Bardon was an alchemist, and this is quite possible that this information was, that Randolph knew it 100 years earlier, and Bardon knew it also from similar sources. I did want to mention that, because you will find, now of course when we talk about P.B. Randolph, though, there's one thing. P.B. Randolph, he had he had two other things too that he came up with that he should get credit for. One was the flashing colors that ended up in the Golden Dawn's lexicon, and Randolph came up with the flashing colors for sigils. And Randolph also came up with the 9th degree for the OTO. In fact, if you read Randolph's material on sex magic, it's virtually the whole OTO 9th degree program laid out, and with even more detail. And Randolph, I'm diverging a little bit on the bar, but Randolph, as some of you may remember, he was an American, and he was a black man, and it was back before the war between the states. He was a black man, and he was teaching white women sex magic, so that was a little shady in those days. And finally, after the war between the states, he went a little bit nuts and blew his brains out in his front yard to convince his next door neighbor that he was capable of doing it, or something like that. So he got written out of all of the rest of the textbooks on Western magic. All of his contributions got forgotten, and they still used them, but Randolph became the man who never was. And yet, in fact, we got a cartoon coming up in the 7th grade this time that shows this little German guy with a monocle and a spiked helmet and a riding crop, and he's mounted on a barmaid, and he's going, and ein, zwei, drei, vier, and he's reading a book, and it's called Sex Magic by P.B. Randolph, and the caption of the cartoon is The Origins of German Sex Magic, so that we ought to get some laughs out of that. Anyway, Bardon, by the way, so while we're talking about that, Bardon was very much aware of the 9th degree, of the OTO's 9th degree. Some people say he was a member of the OTO. That's possible. At that time, that was pre-Crowley. And he does have one chapter in Initiation into Hermetics where he very, very carefully, in great circumspection, discusses that aspect of magic. Now, when it comes to elementals, Bardon Bardon personified, like Schroepfer and some of the other German magicians. Bardon was romantic, was very romantic. He personified the spirits of the elements. The gnomes were little miners down there with their little pickaxes, and the sylphs were beautiful fairies flying in the air, and the salamanders were the creatures of fire, and the undines were the beautiful water spirits. In fact, Loomer, his son, was out walking with him one day, and Bardon says, "Oh, do you see the gnome?" And Loomer said, "No, Dad, I don't see the gnome." but so Bardon was able to actually see the elementals, and this this is romantic but very effective when you're working with them. I mentioned this magnetic and electric fluid. This has quite a application in Tantra, the dividing the human body into areas of magnetic and electric fluidity, and the interplay of the magnetic and electric fluids. And of course, this is one of the things that Bardon emphasized, part of the control of not just the elements, but the flow of the power of the elements. And I remember Simon, King of the Witches. In Simon, they have the blue and the red robes, and they're holding, and the DA's daughter's holding a blue ball in one hand, the red ball in the other, and they make quite a thing about Athos and Simon, King of the Witches, and so. But the control of the magnetic and electric fluids is part of what we're talking about. Now, as I said, Bardon was a professional hypnotist, an alchemist. He actually made his living as a naturopath, as what we would call a homeopathic doctor, and he had some training in that. But he was a natural healer, and his whole house was filled with alchemical tinctures, and he did a lot more with plant alchemy as far as his remedies are concerned than metallic alchemy. He wasn't that much into metallic alchemy as far as I can tell, because most of what we can tell from his biography is that he was primarily using plant alchemy for healing purposes. Now, I want to mention, by the way, the book Memories of Franz Bardon by Dr. Loomer Bardon and Dr. M.K. And this is one of Mercure Publishing's efforts that just come out recently. And this is it's a short book, but it's a wonderful book, and it's got all kinds of pictures of Franz and his family, and tells the whole story of his life, and with comments on his philosophy, both by his son and by his main student, Dr. M.K. And both of whom I hope have a chance to listen to this program, either tonight or archived, because I certainly like to hear from you. But one of the things that I want to point out was with Franz Bardon, he only lived to, just about 50 years of age. And after what he suffered in the Nazi concentration camp, that's enough to kill 2 or 3 people. But his health wasn't good, and he was overweight, and he smoked too much. In fact, he quit smoking one time just for a whole year, just to show that, just to prove to himself he could do it. But then he went back to smoking, and he drank a lot of coffee. I can sure relate to that because I went through that period myself. And finally died. When he died, after he'd been arrested by the Czech secret police for being an occultist. Again, that they arrested him for being anything to do with spirituality, as far as the communists were concerned, was enough to put you in jail. So they did, and poor Franz was in jail, and his pancreas was giving out on him. And he asked his wife for some smoked bacon, and she sent him some, and that did it. And that was the end of him. But you can't blame poor Marie for that. I mean, Franz wanted it, and he says, I want some bacon, and well, he got it. Well, that was it. But he said, when asked, well, you heal all these other people, and you're such a great healer, why can't you heal yourself? when he said, well, I tried one time, he said, one time I used one of my herbal remedies and it backfired on me and I've never done it again. He said, I had to accept. He said, I have to accept when I came into this body of mine, he said, I had to accept the karma. So what ended up happening is that his student, who was a medical doctor, he prescribed regular medicine for him, and Bardon wouldn't take any of his own remedies. He wouldn't because he believed that Franz Bardon that he came into, he had to respect that karma and let that karma play out. Now that may sound like rationalization to some people, but I don't think so. I tend to go along with that because I know I've felt as a magician. There are times when I've thought about doing things for myself that I thought, well, I don't know whether I ought to do that, but I know, I can relate to that. Anyway, the problem here, as I say, is that when he was arrested and when he finally died, his son tried to recover his papers, and the Czech communist police, they shredded all of his notes, everything leading toward his book. Now, before we sign off on him, there's another book of his that I want to discuss, and sort of kind of, on the one hand, I want to make a cautionary note on it. On the other hand, I think you could really enjoy it once you understand it. Bardon wrote, with the help of his secretary, Ati Vodovova. I don't know whether Ati's still alive, but Ati Vodovova firmly believed that Franz was God on earth. I mean, she just absolutely worshipped him. He wrote this novel, kind of based somewhat on his own experiences, but they call it a novel, and it should be called a novel because it's a bit too fantastic to be really. But it's on the other hand, there is truth. You have to pick the truth out of Frabato. That's the name of this book. It's called Frabato, and Frabato was his magical name. And that's a contraction of Franz and Bardon and the town he was from and Germany and whatever. He put together like you'd put together a magical sigil. He put together this name for himself, Frabato, and that's what he used as a stage name. And so the novel is called Frabato. It also has some spiritual writings of his in the back, which are also very, very good. But Frabato is fantastic, and it's kind of like it's sort of like Doctor Strange. I mean, it's a very romantic and a very fantastic story, but it captures the flavor of the time, and there is, as I say, if you read between the lines, you can read some truth in it. When I said at the beginning of this program that we would discuss some of the derivations and all that we've made from Bardon's work. I want to explain that those of you who are familiar with the OTA, you know that we use magic mirrors with a regular optical mirror and a dark optical mirror, and we key off of the reflection of our faces. We use that reflective morph that when you stare at your reflection in a dim light with the candles, and your face will black out, and then when it returns, it's distorted into some other form. And of course, when you put the sigil on the mirror, and that helps to direct the change of the form to where it becomes the spirit. And when you're properly trained, of course, you can talk to the spirit can talk to you. And that's the method we use for Galatia. So that is not Franz Bardon's magical mirror method. I want to make that clear. Franz Bardon, his mirrors were not optical. They were not reflective. They were made out of plaster, and they were concave, hopefully round if he could do them that way. And he would make them out of plaster, make them fairly smooth but concave, and then he'd put this he'd put this these fluid condensers right directly on the face of the mirror, and then cover them with black lacquer, seal them up, and then you would use that, and you would stare at that, and that would be your focus, and that would be your conjuration device. And he put them on a triangle, very similar to the way we do it, with an elevated triangle and the whole business. But the mirrors themselves, I'm looking at one. Sandria has one up on right now, and I'm looking at our great big black mirror with a toddler stuck in the middle of it. But these were definitely non-optic. Now, my feeling is this: I think that when you get above your sod and you get past, the Galatian above your sod, I believe that you should use non-optic mirrors. So I'm all for Bardon's method. I think you should go non-optic when you get above your sod when it comes to the mirrors, and therefore I'm a firm believer in Bardon's program and his training. I think that using the optic mirror with Galatia and down in the bottom of your sod is that's a good way to start. Shows you can do it. But when you get higher on up, I think you should definitely be working with your trained imagination. Remember that, your highly trained imagination, using these wonderful methods and training program of his. Now, we've developed, over a period of time, ways of enhancing or making Bardon's exercises go a little smoother and a little easier. Techniques like, for instance, Bardon had you doing Kim's game, where you put out a bunch of common objects on a tray and you memorize them, and then you try to recreate that picture of them so you can remember them. And that Bill Gray came up with an improvement on that. He said, okay, use a shot glass and a disc and a red paintbrush and a paring knife, and then you got the Grail Hallows, and you can work with those and visualize those. That's an improvement, but basically, Bardon his methods are really, really good, and they should be used in this program. I think that Bardon is probably one of, if not the most prominent and most highly skilled and innovative magician of the 20th century. And I know there are people who would say, well, what about Crowley? Well, Crowley made his contributions. Crowley certainly did make his contributions. But Bardon's idea of hooking yoga up with magic and putting the two together and making it go and training people to be genuine magicians, this is a marvelous accomplishment. I highly recommend Bardon's books, and starting with Initiation into Hermetics, and then moving on to Magical Evocation and Key to the True Kabbalah. And then if you want to read Frabato, well, for fun and whatever else you want to get out of it, that's good too. And then, but definitely, as you do this, get Memories of Franz Bardon by Dr. Loomer and Dr. M.K. from Mercure. Definitely get that one and read it. That's wonderful. Okay, that's all for tonight. Next week, call in. We're going to have call-ins on Franz Bardon. And I know that some of you guys are going to want to call in, gals are going to want to call in, so call in, and if I made some mistakes, have at me. That's what I'm here for. Okay, we'll see you next week, and meanwhile, good magic.